Have you wondered why MS Dhoni doesn't own the helicopter shot? Or why garbage in the stadium after an IPL match isn't cleared? Or why even sports betting is illegal in India? I'll be honest, I haven't always thought of these topics until I read it in a fascinating book that I got hold of. And again, I'll be honest that I myself don't have answer to these questions. But as they say, Kamit diyar, Kamath the man. And so, I'm not talking about our co-host Amit Kamath. I'm talking about one of the finest legal minds in India, a man who with his ideas and thoughts sparks curiosity and provokes a lot more. I mean, I have personally benefited from his knowledge on many things sport, and I'm confident you shall too. Joining us today is Nandan Kamath, a friend of the pod who was here last time to guide us through the complexities of IPL's expansion and returns today as an author of the book Boundary Lap. Nandan, welcome again. We have lots to talk about, of course, but let's just start with Kamath diyar, Kamath the man. How peeved were you when you didn't get that thing? But just take us through the whole story.
Yeah, so first of all, great to be here and great to be with you, Mihir and Amit. I mean, that's the first line of my book, So thanks for giving it away. But it was actually a headline in Oxford College newspaper. And I was a junior cricketer at a pretty high level till I stopped playing and became a lawyer. But when I went back to Oxford, I'd actually started playing at a reasonable level and was sort of slated to be in the Oxford team, but unfortunately had an injury. But what I did do after the injury was play for my college team. And this was a pretty big match, intercollegiate rivalry, in which despite all the challenges and my injuries, I managed to score some runs and get a few wickets. And a few days later, I saw this headline. It said, Kamath the hour, Kamath the man. And I couldn't believe I hadn't thought of that one before, because I've always, throughout my college life, and I've always been known as someone who makes puns. So this was a very telling moment for me. Someone else had thought of a better pun than I'd ever thought of, and it related to me. So I think the line in my book is when the puns were more important than the runs, I realized that was the end of my cricket career and perhaps another career to take on.
But at least you have a good pun, because all the puns in my life have been relating to Vada Pav. So, but again, like we'll be going into the serious issues later on. But just tell me one thing: you are a fine legal brain. If a man here uses Kamath diyar, Kamath the man now, will you be able to sue him and get that?
No, I think he's equally legitimate, Kamath, to make that line. But I'm certainly not a fine legal mind, but certainly someone who's excited about the law and particularly the relationship with sport. So that's something I've sort of breathed and lived for many years. So excited to talk about those issues.
So because the IPL is in the news, we figured we should talk about issues in your book that most resonate with, when people watch the IPL, it's something that will come into their mind. So one of the most fascinating chapter heads that I saw was you asking, should Dhoni own the helicopter shot? Which is very fascinating. I never thought about it. Should Dhoni be able to copyright the helicopter shot and tell other cricketers that if you are going to play the shot, you pay me? Can he do that? Should he do that?
Yeah, and I think, again, without giving away too much of my book, it was one of the most interesting and exciting chapters to write. So my background is in intellectual property law. And to me, I've always sort of tried to understand and challenge, why do we have intellectual property law in the first place at all? And it's a very interesting system. So what it's saying is that we can give someone private property and private rights so long as they invent something and are willing eventually to hand it over to the public domain. So this is a topic which was quite interesting to me because it sort of talks about the interrelationship between private rights and public rights. And the short answer is no, Dhoni does not own the helicopter shot. And we see that across many sports. But the essence is what makes people innovate or create, and what are the types of incentives that work. And in many ways, what are the incentives that people may not even need in order to innovate or create. And the reality sport, to me, forms a very interesting test ground or a sandbox to test a lot of these propositions. The relationship between private ownership and public rights. So who do I need to take someone else's permission to use something that has been created? And to me, the really interesting overlay of this was sport and how sport is learned, passed on, improved and grown as well. So everyone at all points of time is borrowing from the past to create a future, right? And Dhoni as well. And it's one of the things I address in the book is perhaps also borrowing from the past. You have a Kapil Dev's Nataraj shot. You have a Ravi Shastri's Chapati shot. So I mean, the Chapati, the Nataraj eventually could become the helicopter. It's a little bit more advanced in technology. But the reality is in sport, we're always taking from the past trying to improve upon it. And that spark of innovation isn't an intentional spark saying, today I'm going to create something. It might come up in practice and something you respond to. A lot of sport innovation is, in fact, in the moment. Yep. But of course, there are some very unusual ones which really make us challenge and question this. And the biggest one of all is the Fosbury flop, which really transformed the way the high jump was jumped. And it completely transformed the scale of, I would say, achievement in the high jump. But even that, someone who spent the time completely revolutionizing the way someone goes over the bar in the high jump. The question still to ask is, person who was first, will they be the one to use it best? And actually, the high jump record is one of the longest standing world records in the world. And it wasn't Fosbury who actually set it, but it was someone else, Javier Sotomayor, using the Fosbury technique. So it asks a lot of questions. So just because you're first to do something, should you own it? And does sport have an interest in private ownership by the inventor? And there's also this notion of, is there only one person who creates this, or is it an amalgamation of multiple different processes? And why is this interesting? Because one, in sport, it asks you, what is to be kept within the sort of the purview and the rights of everyone in sport to keep on improving, tinkering with and growing? And how much can you actually take away for a private individual? Because what are you testing? You're not testing innovation. You're testing capability, right? So should everything that is possible to do with the human body be available to all people at all points of time? And you're rewarding the person who uses existing public knowledge the best in a sporting context. Or do you want to build little fiefdoms of people creating new things, building different ways of doing things, and you're competing among techniques? The reality, sport is about competition between people, not about ways of innovating equipment. In fact, lots of equipment guidelines would ensure that there's a level playing field even at the equipment level. So why shouldn't you have a level playing field in the techniques, methods, and ways of doing?
But one of the things that you also talk about in the book is every aspect of sport, like all things in life, are copyrighted, right? I mean, from the kind of innovations in bat to the bails that are used, if you're talking only about cricket. Then if like XYZ cricketer, if we leave aside Dhoni and his helicopter shot, if he has invented a thing, for example, you mentioned the Fosbury flop. I mean, if you look at the Panenka, that is a genuine innovation, I guess even a well thought out one. Do players have the right to then kind of say that, look, every other aspect of sport is been monetized and it's been copyrighted, then why can't I do my own thing?
In fact, just to add to that, like imagine a clip of Dhoni playing the helicopter shot is like somebody holding a right to that. So you can't use that without their permission. But Dhoni cannot own. Why is that?
No, it's a very interesting question because actually the whole entire sports business is actually driven on intellectual property. Copyright and broadcast rights in the broadcast. You have trademarks in merchandise. I mean, all sorts of different patents in the types of like golf club or even, like you say, the bails which go off and show light. And the argument is that all of that is commercialized. Why isn't the core of sport commercialized in the same way or available for privatization? Let me put it that way, right? Exclusivity and privatization. And it really gets to the core of the question of what is the role of sport in society. The question is, would you allow some language, like the vocabulary of a language, to be unavailable to people pursuing the same thing? And to me, it's about testing boundaries, testing human boundaries to see what we're all capable of. Not just individually, but even when you play an individual sport, you're actually a small speck in a larger ecosystem of being human. And as athletes, I think every athlete is in the context of their team, but in the context of every single participant who's part of the sports pyramid. And the minute you give one person preferential access to ways of doing, even if they've come up with it for the first time, you're actually putting human evolution back by 20 years of a patent or 50, 70 years of a copyright. I don't think it's in the interest of sport to actually allow athletes to privatize ways of doing, which could be taken forward by other people, which you might not want to set up a permission-based system in terms of if I want to use a Panenka on this penalty, I need to go and get a license or adding cost to doing things. So the point is to keep the playing field as level and free for, I would say, in-moment innovation, responsive innovation. You can't have an athlete think, oh, will I be infringing a right if I play this shot? You play it in the moment. There's not even a sort of a full second to think about what you're doing. So keeping play free, flowing and instinctive isn't really incompatible with setting up this permission-based system of rights and exclusivities and patents and copyrights.
I mean, you say no, but I kind of press you there and ask, I mean, are we moving towards that world? Because we always kind of reading these, athletes versions nowadays, especially in the last year or two, of them kind of realizing that the powers that be, if we take football, then in that case, FIFA and game developers, they are using athletes' profile and benefiting from it. And now athletes are standing up and saying that if you're using my face, I want, whatever, X, Y, Z.
Yes, and I think that's a very relevant point around name, image, and likeness.
Yeah.
So that moves into the realm of publicity rights. So while we were talking about the moves that are the vocabulary of the game, the minute you take it to one level higher, right? And there's a huge debate over whether modes of celebration can be trademarked. And lots of athletes have actually gone and trademarked the way they celebrate, even their outline forms a logo like Air Jordan. Different aspects of the publicity rights of an athlete are now available for, I would say, exclusivity. So what you're preventing is someone else commercializing the rights, name, image, likeness of a player. And there's a very significant debate on who owns that and how it's being packaged outwards. Do federations, do the associations, do leagues own these rights, or do individual athletes own them? In the US, very clear precedent. It's statutory law to have publicity rights. And a huge debate is ongoing even in the NCAA, which has just been sort of moved to athletes being paid for their name, image, and likeness. In Europe, you have privacy rights leading to publicity rights. In India, we have a very early understanding of what publicity rights is, and it's going to become a more and more significant issue. I don't know if you followed recently. There was a sort of a fake video created of Virat Kohli endorsing a brand which he'd never even produced. So when you combine AI, generative AI, video-based creationism, because all of these guys, their voice and their image is out there all over the place, right? But we've seen a couple of new cases with Anil Kapoor's voice, a couple of other judgments, Sachin Tendulkar. So we have to be ready for a very new and emerging set of threats to the commercialization of athletes in a way that has never been imagined before. So getting the legal system right for some of these things, absolutely spot on here to actually be ahead of this game. It is slightly different from what I would call on-field core assets, which should be available to all. Everybody. But I think there are aspects of your private world, which is including your publicity, including your right to commercialize the work that you do, and in particular off the field, has to be protected and has to be prevented from what I would call free riding and misappropriation by others. Right. So very interrelated points, but I think on the field of play, your reward is victory. And your reward in many ways, if you do something truly unique, and the fact that we're talking about Dhoni, a Panenka, you could talk about a Dilshan. There is a longevity, and I mean, you are remembered for having created something, and maybe that memory and legacy is good enough. You don't necessarily need to be paid for leaving your stamp on a sport.
Maybe you'll be left with an NFT of that.
Moving on, the second question that struck us from the book was, why is it that any IPL fan right now can own a fantasy team, can make money off that, but cannot actually bet on a team, but if they wanted to, they can bet on horses. So what is this gray area? What is this, I can bet on a certain sport, but not on any other sport. And I can bet on IPL through various other ways, which seems a lot like betting. It's not that much different maybe. So could you just explain the contours of that gray areas?
So it's one of the chapters I talk about, like why is sports betting illegal when betting on horse racing isn't? And actually try and understand the sort of the evolution and history of how both of these have grown in some sense, right? And the underlying element of the book is that we regulate in different ways using multiple different tools. Law is just one of them, but also the way markets, architectures, and more than anything, I would say social morality plays out in regulating our behavior. So if I said sports betting, the first thing you think of is like some seedy underground guy keeping a book with mobile phones. And that's the story we've been presented.
The image of an underworld don comes to mind sitting with a big...
Exactly. So I don't even need to explain it. So exactly. So you've got the picture. But when I say horse racing, it's like some guy going in a suit and a hat and
really fancy headgear.
Horses racing. It's actually in the newspaper. Results are in the newspaper. And I mean, there is a colonial legacy to this. In fact, the horse racing was excluded from what is called betting by multiple court decisions even, which hold it to be a game of skill. So the decisions go back to looking at horse racing itself as a game of skill. And state that recognizing which horse and which jockey work well together, there's an element of skill to it, which makes it not betting. Now, it's very difficult to differentiate that from evaluating how good a cricket team will be and which one is going to win, which one is not going to win, right? There's enough statistics, data, and other things like that. So Actually, I used the chapter to ask a more fundamental question of how do laws come to be, and when making decisions, perhaps even judges influenced by how can two things that look almost identical get such disparate and different legal treatment. And the reality is that we had a historical in the open activity. We have race clubs in the big cities of India. Elite of the country are at those race clubs. There's betting happening. It's in the booth. You can see where it's happening. So it's a very regulated and very, in some sense, escalated elite type of activity. At the same time, you have cricket betting or other sports betting, which has notion of an underbelly. And the reality is that we are all influenced not simply by saying this looks like this and let's treat them equally, but in fact, how do these two, they fundamentally sound the same, but they're very different. Look who's betting here. Look where it's happening. There are cameras. Everyone knows it's happening. The elite of the city are there. My other judges also might be going and betting is one of the jokes I have in the book. But I don't think anyone wants to admit that sports betting is actually not that dissimilar from horse racing. And we haven't really been able to address that. There is actually a pending case in the court suggesting that betting on sport is actually a game of skill. It hasn't made too much headway. But if anything, this has been further exacerbated by offshore betting. And the way that foreign websites have really, I would say, infiltrated India, advertised in India, got away so far with very early attempts by the government to push back. But if anything, this has only made things worse for it being seen as a underbelly activity, illegal. Only from outside people are using sort of underhanded measures to get there. Perhaps not a healthy sign for the future of something that could well be brought into the open and made legal.
We've spoken about this before, right? I mean, the way offshore betting websites are trying to make inroads in India. If we were to look at the bigger picture, isn't this, like you said, it's giving a kind of unfair picture or a dangerous picture in a way? If we were to head in a direction where sports betting is to made legal in India, then are we looking at fantasy gaming apps as a soft launch towards that eventually, you feel? Or is it better to have like one regulated marketplace rather than pretending right now as we are that it's not allowed, let's not do it, and still like there are ways to get it done?
There are very different models in different places. The US still a few years ago, actually betting was illegal. The fantasy market grew tremendously. But I think a case maybe 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even further back, actually opened up the betting market. And now both betting and fantasy coexist in very different spaces, and they play very different roles.
And in US, the fantasy gaming was a launchpad of sorts for making sports betting legal. Is it fair to say that?
I don't know if you'd call it a launchpad, but definitely it populated a space while sports betting was illegal for people who wanted to engage with the game, with statistics, with analysis. In India, where fantasy, and to get back to your question, Amit, so the difference between fantasy's legal treatment and sports bettings is that fantasy is in fact seen as an over-the-top game. So you're not actually seen as taking on the cricket match or football match. What you're doing is you're creating a new team, a virtual team, which relates to the real-world event. So what you're doing is you're seen to be staking on your own skill. You're not staking on whether Rohit Sharma or Virat Kohli is going to score more today or whether India or Pakistan is going to win. There's a notion that when you're making these multiple decisions, you're choosing 11, you're keeping out another 11, you're choosing captain, vice captain. There's a complexity and there's a strategy to this game. You're being presented a certain bunch of rules. And the fact that you have to make so many decisions, not some one binary pick whether one or the other is going to happen, you've created a new game. And the staking that is happening, at least that's what the court decisions say, is this new over-the-top game itself is a game of skill. And there's nothing that prevents you from staking on your own skill. In the same way you could play a match of golf and say, if I win, I'll give you 100 rupees. If you win, or rather, if I win, you give me 100 rupees. And if you win, I will give you 100 rupees. So you're staking on your own skill. Where sports betting is seen is what is called a side betting. You're actually betting on the skill of somebody else.
There is a skill element still involved in it.
The question in the horse racing case actually tries to bridge that, which says that horse racing itself is a game of skill, and your ability to choose the horse, the jockey, and who's going to win in that particular context is a separate skill. What has not happened in the translation with sports betting is recognizing that picking whether Kohli or Rohit Sharma is going to score more today has a skill element in itself. Or is it just complete chance? Because the reality is that one good ball and Rohit Sharma might be out, and that you had no control over that, right? But over 11 picks of a fantasy team, things average out, and 11 decisions you can call, I would say, the influence of the participant is way higher than a single decision, which can be knocked off by one thing. Over 11 decisions, good decisions average out with things that are outside the control.
Right.
So I would say user control is way higher in a fantasy contest where there are 11 players versus a binary betting context. But I mean, these are all technicalities, and the reality is a lot of regulation comes down to what does it look like.
Perception. As you said, the smell test.
Smell test. Absolutely a smell test. And it's a good way to put it, Amit. So when you look at horse racing, it passes the smell test because there are certain type of people who are going there. It's in the newspapers. There's glamour, there's glory. But the other one is the sort of the underbelly.
Yeah.
And when you look at these two, they don't look at all the same.
Yeah.
But actually, maybe they're functionally not very different. The provocation here is, how do we make our laws, and do they always make logical sense? Maybe not.
And to the last topic, Amit, we were talking, and this is a thing that fascinated both of us. It's one of the very interesting topics in the book, is the Tokyo Olympics. And we saw an innovation over there where archers and their heart rates were shown live on TV. And at that point, I think both of us, and I think many of us, wondered how far will kind of sport push the boundaries to make it kind of entertaining and engage viewership. Archery, of course, was one of the sports from Tokyo which got great engagement. And you wonder whether these were the innovations that led to it. And then you address the topic head on. What do you think of it?
Yeah, and I think this is going to be one of the biggest battlegrounds going forward. We talked about publicity rights earlier, but privacy rights of athletes. And how far are we going to go into the inner lives of athletes is going to be really one of the most interesting, but perhaps the hardest fought battles going forward. Because I think our capability to actually go in the inner life of an athlete is going up. And I'll give you this very specific example from Tokyo. So the reality is, for many years before Tokyo, World Archery tested many methods, and one of them was to use wearables to keep testing and broadcast. But they actually gave up on wearables, saying it's probably not great for the athlete. But the reality is, by the end, they had a deal with the broadcast partner of the ICC, where the cameras were so good. With the IOC, where the camera technology was so good that it could just look at your pupils and the facial expressions and determine down to the beat what your existing heart rate was. So the reality is something that would previously have required the consent of an athlete. So to put on a wearable, do we test it? Suddenly has moved to something which is no longer requiring of the athlete's consent. To be fair, World Archery took the consent of all the athletes. So the ones who did not consent were not subject to this, right? So they went through the right process. But to me, the provocation is, how far are we going to go?
Yeah. What stops some individual broadcaster from doing that who does not have a right?
And that technology exists today.
Yeah.
So at some point, technology goes way beyond what, as humans, we may even want to allow. And sport, to me, is really just a little bit of a petri dish. We're testing all of these things. All of these issues are there out in the open. Facial recognition technology, even the way you sort of interact with your Aadhaar card or your fingerprint, and other things like that. How much are you going to give up to an authority, a state, or even a federation? But more interestingly, when we put our athletes out there on the biggest stages, are we entitled to everything of them? Yeah. Or are there lines which we would want to draw and say, okay, there is a dignity, there's a privacy, there's an element where it's mine, and what happens within me, is it really for all to consume as a matter of entertainment? I think athletes live very difficult professional lives. Their greatest successes, but also their worst moments are out there in the public. As journalists, as lawyers, we all make mistakes, right? But not the whole world isn't watching while we make those mistakes.
Plus, as you pointed out in your book, one of the first things an athlete does after winning a medal is having to urinate in a cup, which I think is...
Imagine after your greatest success, we can talk about getting pissed off a bit to that.
So you were saying?
No, but this is really at the heart of one of the largest debates between private rights and public rights. So as someone watching it, yes, great, like, look at how nervous someone got and they shot the arrow in the wrong direction. Now there's drama, there's enjoyment of someone's downfall. Yeah. But on the other hand, if someone managed through the toughest of times to keep their heart rate calm and got an arrow. So you're seeing the ups, you're seeing the highs, you're seeing the lows. But I would just ask the question, how much are we entitled to as spectators? And is it all a circus? Or is there a recognition that these are actually fellow human beings who are not out there just as actors, but this is their life, there's a human element and dignity to it. And where are we going to draw the line? So this book is really not about answering these questions, but asking them and perhaps provoking debate. You use the word provocation right at the start. I do hope this is the beginning of many things. This is by no means the last word on many of these topics. But the fact that we can ask these questions and I think just get more people to think about them, to more than anything for me, feel a stakeholdership of what happens in sport is really important to everyone. because it's such a unique space where we can test all these boundaries, not just human boundaries, but social boundaries. A lot of the questions you asked of what is right, what is wrong, what seems off, what seems right. Sport presents us a very unique and valuable opportunity. And I think we all have a stake in keeping it real, keeping it fair, and making sure that it's run in the way that gives us the best outcomes and best understanding of what the human condition is.
I mean, we promised at the start of this episode that there will be a lot of thought-provoking conversations here. Nandan has lived up to his promise over there and the pressure that we put on him without having any of those things. But Nandan, we won't let you go before one question that Amit had in mind. Yeah. So Amit,
proper beamer. It's not even a bouncer. Because you come from Bengaluru, the question is, can Royal Challengers Bangalore's fan sue the franchise for their team not performing? Can they actually sue the team for them not winning any titles? And these guys investing, 16 years without trophy?
I'm actually one of the lawyers of Royal Challengers Bangalore, so I would be very interested in this research, the answer to this. But for the record, I'm saying no.
Well, RCB fans, you know whom to approach now. If there is ever...
RCB has won the Women's Premier League. So.
Oh yeah, that's true. They've lived up to at least one thing. But no, thanks a lot, Nandan, for your time. We are at the beautiful offices of AISTS. So thanks for them for providing us a nice space to record this podcast. And the book's out. Nandan, would you like to mention where it's available and where they can...
available online and at most bookstores. It's Boundary Lab, published by Penguin Viking.
Great. Thanks a lot. I hope all of you had great time listening to this conversation. You'll have a better time reading the book, so please do grab it. Thanks, Nandan, once again for joining us today.
Great pleasure. Thank you, Amit.
Thank you so
much.
Mihir.
So, do log on to theindianexpress.com. We'll be back next week with the fresh episode of Game Time. Thank you for listening.
You were listening to Express Sports by The Indian Express. This week's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.